My name is Leand, and I never imagined my life could unravel in such a slow, suffocating way. If someone had told me a year ago that my marriage would collapse, I would have laughed it off. But looking back now, I can see how the signs had been there all along. I was just too blind to see them. Or maybe I just didn't want to. It started small. A few missed goodnight kisses. A couple of dinners eaten in silence. I told myself it was just stress that Edra, my wife of 10 years, was going through a rough patch at work. But then weeks passed, then months, and the silence between us grew into something thick, heavy, impossible to ignore. I used to wake up to her body curled next to mine, her warmth grounding me in ways I never realized I needed. Now I woke up to cold sheets, the space between us on the bed growing wider each night. She stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped asking how my day was, stopped looking at me as if I was the man she had once promised forever to. Then the late nights started. At first it was work-related. At least, that's what she told me. Sorry, Leand. The team needs me. I'll be late. The texts became repetitive, automatic, lacking any real emotion. The excuses were perfectly reasonable at first, but then I started noticing things. The scent of cologne on her clothes, one that wasn't mine. The way she'd flinch when I tried to touch her. How she started sleeping with her phone clutched in her hand, tucking it under the pillow as if she were guarding a secret. I wanted to believe I was overthinking, that I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew. One night after another of her late shifts, I sat in the dark, waiting for her to come home. She walked through the door at 2:17 a.m., her hair slightly disheveled, her lipstick faded. When she saw me sitting on the couch, she froze. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice tight. I stared at her for a long time. "Who is he?" Her reaction told me everything. The way her throat tightened as she swallowed. The way she quickly looked away as if the walls had suddenly become more interesting. But she didn't answer. Instead, she exhaled sharply, muttered something about being exhausted, and walked right past me to the bedroom. That was the moment I realized she had already left me. Maybe not physically, not yet, but emotionally. She was gone, and I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. I barely slept that night. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Edra breathing beside me. It wasn't the soft, peaceful breathing I used to love, the kind that signaled she was safe, content in the arms of someone she trusted. No, this was different. It was distant, shallow, like she was barely present even in sleep, like she was just waiting for morning so she could escape again. I turned my head, watching her silhouette in the dim moonlight. The woman lying beside me was still my wife, but at the same time, she wasn't. The Edra I knew would have never let this silence take root between us. The Edra I married would have reached for me, pulled me close, whispered reassurances in the dark. But this version of her, she was just gone. Morning came, and with it, the same routine we had been stuck in for months. She barely acknowledged me as she got ready for work. The air between us was thick, suffocating. "I might be late tonight," she said, grabbing her purse. I didn't respond. I just watched her from the kitchen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. She hesitated for a moment, as if expecting me to say something. Maybe she wanted me to ask her why. Maybe she wanted to fight, an excuse to turn me into the villain. But I wasn't going to give her that, not yet. So she left, and I sat there, feeling like a fool. I couldn't do this anymore. I needed the truth, and I needed it now. The investigation. That was the day I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make in my marriage. I needed proof. I needed to see with my own eyes what my gut was already screaming at me. So I did something that felt like both betrayal and self-preservation. I called a private investigator. His name was Alden, a man in his late 50s with a voice that carried the weight of too many broken marriages. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just listened as I explained my suspicions, nodding along like he had heard it all before. "She's hiding something," I said. "I just need to know what." Alden exhaled through his nose. "Most people who come to me already know the answer, Leland. They just need confirmation." That sentence hit harder than I wanted to admit. We set everything up, tracking her movements, keeping an eye on her late nights at work. It didn't take long. Nights later, Alden sent me a message. "You need to see this." My stomach twisted as I opened the attached photos. There she was, Edra, my wife, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, her hand resting on the arm of another man, leaning in close, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. And then my chest caved in, her lips on his. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The walls closed in around me as I stared at the images, unable to breathe, unable to think. This was it. This was real. She was cheating on me. The moment everything changed. I don't know how long I sat there staring at my phone. Minutes. Hours. The world outside moved on. But I was frozen in that moment, trapped in a reality I never wanted to face. When Edra walked through the door that night, I was waiting for her. She didn't expect me to be awake. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the lamp overhead. For a second, I thought she might confess, that she might see the devastation on my face, and finally tell me the truth. But she didn't. She just dropped her keys onto the counter. "Why are you up?" she asked. I slid my phone across the table toward her. She didn't even have to pick it up. One glance at the screen, and her whole body went stiff. Silence. Thick, unbearable silence. Then finally, she spoke. "Leanne, it's not what you think." I let out a hollow laugh. "That's the best you've got? Really?" She swallowed, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone. "I can explain." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Then explain, Edra. Explain why my wife has been sneaking around behind my back. Explain why you've been ignoring me for months. Explain why you're kissing another man." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, but nothing came out, because there was no explanation, only the truth. And the truth was, she had already chosen someone else. She just hadn't told me yet. I felt something inside me snap. I wasn't going to wait around for her to decide when to leave. So the next morning, I made my own choice. I packed my bags and I walked away. Walking away should have felt like freedom. It should have been a relief to finally break free from the weight of betrayal, to reclaim my life instead of waiting for Edra to decide when she was finally done with me. But as I stepped out of the house that morning, suitcase in hand, all I felt was emptiness. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. Hours passed, the highway stretching endlessly ahead of me. The city faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by miles of nothingness. I barely registered the road signs, the gas stations, the world moving past me at 70 miles per hour. All I could hear was the echo of her voice from the night before. "Leland, it's not what you think. I can explain." Lies. She hadn't even tried to deny it. Not really. She had just stood there, caught, exposed, scrambling for words that wouldn't come because she had nothing left to say. And I had stood there like an idiot, waiting for her to admit what I already knew. I had wasted too much time on her silence. By the time I finally stopped driving, the sun had set, and I found myself in some nameless town, parked outside a cheap motel. The neon vacancy sign buzzed overhead, casting flickering light onto the cracked pavement. It was the kind of place people disappeared into when they didn't want to be found. I checked in without thinking. The receptionist didn't ask questions. I paid in cash, took my key, and locked myself inside a room that smelled like stale air and regret. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. I had no reason to call her, no reason to check for messages, but my fingers moved on their own. Opening the screen, scrolling through old photos. Our wedding day, our first vacation together, laughing selfies that felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. I hated her. I hated her for what she had done, but I hated myself more for still missing her. I should have known it wouldn't end so easily. The text started the next morning. First it was a single message. "Where are you?" I ignored it. Then another. "Please, Leanne, let me talk." I turned off my phone. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. I wasn't ready to listen to her spin some half-baked story about how it hadn't meant anything, how she had just made a mistake. I had seen the pictures. I had seen the way she looked at him, touched him. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. And she had chosen him. The days blurred together after that. I stayed in that motel, moving between the bed and the window, watching the world go on without me. I didn't answer calls. I didn't respond to emails. I barely ate. Then on the third night, there was a knock at my door. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. I sat there, frozen, listening as it came again. 2 short, sharp knocks. I didn't move. Then I heard her voice. "Leland, I know you're in there." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the bed so hard my knuckles turned white. She had found me. I didn't know how, but she had. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to talk to you." I stayed silent. Another knock, harder this time. "I know you're angry. I know I hurt you, but please let me explain." But there was no explanation left. I had given her more than enough chances. I had asked for her honesty. I had asked for her love, and now all I had was a hollow echo of everything we had once been. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked to the window and stared out at the darkness beyond. The streetlights flickered in the distance. I could hear her voice, still pleading, still desperate, but it didn't matter. She had already made her choice. She just hadn't realized the price yet. I opened the door, and it wasn't who I expected. It was him. I stared at the man, standing in front of me, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Tall, broad shoulders, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt like he had just come from a business meeting. His face was the kind that might be considered attractive in a different situation. Strong jaw, piercing eyes, but all I saw was the man who had disrupted my life. He was the reason my wife had ignored me for weeks. He was the reason everything had fallen apart. I clenched my fists at my sides, every muscle in my body tense. "You've got 5 seconds to turn around and leave before I do something neither of us will like," I said. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he let out a long sigh, like this whole thing was as exhausting for him as it was for me. "We need to talk," he said. I laughed bitterly. "Oh, do we?" He shoved his hands into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to fight you." I stepped forward, closing the space between us. "Then why are you here?" My voice was steady, though inside I was barely holding myself together. He held my gaze, and for a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Hesitation, guilt. I wasn't sure, and I didn't care. "I think you deserve the truth," he said finally. I exhaled sharply, my hands still clenched. "I already know the truth." He shook his head. "No, you don't." I should have slammed the door in his face. I should have told him to take his guilt and leave. But something in his voice, something in the way he stood there looking like he was carrying the weight of the world, made me hesitate. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. "You've got 2 minutes, I said. He nodded, stepping into the motel room. He glanced around, probably taking in the cheap furniture and the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the nightstand. I shut the door behind him and crossed my arms. "Talk." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I didn't come here to make excuses." "Good," I said flatly. "Because I don't want to hear them." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." For a moment he just stood there, staring at the floor like he was trying to figure out how to say whatever it was he needed to say. Then he looked up, and what he said next made my stomach drop. "She lied to both of us." I narrowed my eyes. "What does that mean?" He let out a humorless laugh. "It means she told me she was leaving you, that your marriage was already over, that she was just waiting for the right time to tell you." My breath caught in my throat. "She told me," he continued, "that you were the one who checked out first, that you were distant, that you didn't love her anymore, that she was just a ghost in her own home, and you didn't even notice." He looked away. I believed her. Rage boiled in my chest, not just at him but at her. She had rewritten our entire marriage. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had turned me into the villain in her story. I took a step forward. "And when did you realize she was lying?" He exhaled, looking guilty. "The night you found out." He shook his head. "I saw the way she reacted when you caught her. That wasn't a woman who had been planning to leave. That was a woman who got caught playing both sides." I let out a slow breath, my hands trembling. "So what? You feel bad now? That's supposed to make me feel better." He met my eyes. "No, but I thought you should know." I scoffed. "And what about you, huh? You're some innocent victim in all this." His jaw tightened. "No, I own my part in this. I should have never gotten involved, and I sure as hell should have never believed her lies." I stared at him, trying to decide if I believed anything he was saying. Then before I could stop myself, I asked the one question that had been burning in my mind since the moment I saw those pictures. "Do you love her?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I took a step back, shaking my head. "Get out." He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, but I was done. I walked to the door, yanked it open, and waited. He gave me one last look, something almost like regret in his eyes, before nodding and stepping out. The moment the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I had my answer. She had lied to him. She had lied to me. But worst of all, she had made me disappear from my own life long before I ever walked away. And for that, I would never forgive her. I didn't sleep that night. After he left, I just sat there staring at the door, my mind racing in 100 different directions. The weight of everything, the months of silence, the betrayal, the lies, pressed down on me until I felt like I could barely breathe. She hadn't just cheated. She hadn't just ignored me. She had erased me. She had rewritten the story of our marriage to fit her own needs, painting me as the distant, unloving husband, while she played the role of the abandoned wife. And the worst part, I had almost believed it. I had spent months wondering if I had done something wrong, if I had missed something, failed to be enough for her. But now I saw the truth for what it was. She had been planning this, maybe not from the very beginning, but for long enough to convince herself that she deserved to have both of us, me and him, until the decision was made for her. And now I was supposed to just walk away and pretend it never happened. No, I had spent too long being ignored, being erased. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. The next morning, I packed my things, checked out of the motel, and drove back to the city. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew one thing: she didn't get to control the narrative anymore. When I pulled up to our house, her house now, her car was in the driveway. Good. I climbed out, walked up to the front door, and knocked. A few seconds later, she opened it. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Leland. I pushed past her without waiting for an invitation, stepping into the house that used to be mine. It smelled the same, lavender and vanilla, the scent of a home that no longer belonged to me. She shut the door and turned to face me. "What are you doing here?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel love. I didn't feel heartbreak. I just felt done. "I talked to him," I said. Her face went pale. "What?" I stepped closer. "He told me everything. About the lies, about how you made him think we were already over, about how you made me feel like a ghost in my own marriage while you played the victim." She opened her mouth, but I didn't give her the chance to speak. "I spent so much time wondering what I did wrong," I continued. "But I finally get it now. It wasn't me. It was never me. It was you." She flinched like I had slapped her. "Leland." I held up a hand. "Save it. I don't care anymore." Her lips trembled, tears pooling in her eyes. "Please, can't we just—" "No," I said, my voice steady. "We can't." I pulled the papers from my bag and dropped them on the counter. "Divorce papers." Her breath hitched. "You already filed." I nodded. "I'm done, Edra." She stared at me, her face crumbling. "I never wanted this." I let out a bitter laugh. "Then maybe you shouldn't have destroyed everything we had." Silence for a long moment. She just stood there, looking at the papers, like they were some kind of foreign object, like she couldn't believe this was really happening. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. I turned, walked to the door, and left her standing there in the ruins of the life she had set on fire. As I stepped outside, the sun was rising. A new day, a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I didn't look back. As I walked away from the house that used to be mine, I could still feel her standing there in the doorway, frozen, watching me leave like she hadn't spent months pushing me out of her life. But I didn't stop. I got into my car, shut the door, and let out a long breath. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel. I should have felt relief, maybe even satisfaction, but all I felt was a strange hollow emptiness. It was over. Everything we had built, everything we had been, it was all gone. I started the engine and pulled away from the driveway, heading nowhere in particular. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat, but I ignored it. I already knew who it was. She was probably going to beg, plead, try to twist the story one last time, convince me that she had made a mistake, that we could fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. I drove for hours, the city shrinking in my rearview mirror, until I found myself on a stretch of highway that led toward the coast. The sky was a heavy gray, the kind that promised rain, but I didn't care. I needed space. I needed air. Eventually, I pulled into a small gas station off the highway. It was one of those places that barely looked open, with a single pump and a convenience store that probably hadn't been updated in decades. I stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The weight in my chest felt heavier than ever. I went inside, grabbing a coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, and a pack of gum I didn't need. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as he rang me up. "Rough day," he muttered. not really interested in the answer. Something like that, I said. I paid, and stepped back outside, taking a deep breath. The air smelled like rain and asphalt, a scent that reminded me of road trips I used to take when I was younger, back when life felt simpler, before everything fell apart. I didn't know where I was going next. Maybe I'd keep driving. Maybe I'd find somewhere to stay for the night. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I was free, and that was enough.